9:30. So this West Berkshire local plan examination hearing session is open. As you probably all know, I'm William Fieldhouse, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the plan. A reminder, please, for everyone to switch mobile phones and laptops, etc., onto silent. No fire alarm tests planned today. No. Okay. So usual reminder that if the alarm does sound, we will need to evacuate the building, following the green emergency exit signs and congregating outside. You're probably aware that Ian Kemp, the programme officer, isn't here today. He's at another hearing session in Sheffield, but he is contactable by phone or email if you need to contact him, or if you've got any sort of admin type queries, I guess to have a word with one of the council officers. Yeah. Okay. So this is the third hearing session relating to the proposal in the plan for strategic development at North East Thatcham, previous two being on the 21st and 22nd of May. Following those sessions, I published action points 15 to 26 relating to this proposal, and the council responses to those are set out in document exam 42, which was published on the 21st of June, I think. And that includes a revised version of policy SP17 and reason justification attached as Annex A. A slightly revised version of that annex was published yesterday, I think, and that didn't change the actual wording, but it just identified some of the changes relating compared to the submitted plan with strike through and underlining. So the version that we now have has been thoroughly checked to correctly designate to indicate the difference between the submitted plan and the wording now proposed. So hopefully people have got sight of that. So that was the Annex A was published as document exam 42A yesterday. Right, good. So we'll be referring to that. We also have, in addition to the council's responses to those action points, some documents produced by Litchfields on behalf of the North East Thatcham Partnership. They were published on the 21st of June. Also, there are documents exam 41 and 41A. And in there includes the track changes version of the policy, along with some red text in it indicating the partnership's suggested changes to those. So we'll refer to those documents as necessary today. The agenda was published on Monday. Basically, it just sets out each of the areas that we'll be discussing. I don't think there's any, well, from my point of view, there aren't any other matters relating to this policy at the moment that needs further discussion. But if there is anything actually about the policy that isn't covered by those action points, you can raise it today if necessary. But I don't want to go back over ground that we've spoken about. In terms of the timing, we've got all day if we need it. We'll do the usual thing and have a break around 11. And then break for lunch at 1 o'clock, unless it looks like we're getting close to the finishing at that time. Then we'll decide whether to carry on a bit later, see how we go. It's obviously a warm day. It's going to get warmer. I think we've got as much ventilation as possible, have we? Yeah. I guess the only alternative is to open some of the doors at either end as the sun comes onto the front of the building. Yeah, I think that might be necessary. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right, as you're all aware, the purpose of this session, like the others, is to help me decide if the plan submitted in March 2023 is legally compliant and sound, and if not, how it could be modified to ensure that it is. So as usual, I'll start with some questions to the council on each of the agenda items, and then we will open it up for contributions from others. When you wish to speak, put your nameplate on end, please, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. And when I ask you to speak, if you can put your microphone on, please make sure it's close enough to you at an appropriate height so that it picks up your voice clearly, and turn the microphone off and put your nameplate down when you've finished. So can I go around the table, please, and let the participants introduce themselves, starting first with the council. Thank you.
Emmeline Lambert, Council, West Berkshire.
Rachel Lancaster, West Berkshire Council.
Morning, sir. Mike Bodkin, Town, representing Pinson's Lane.
Good morning, sir. Jack Dickinson, Nexus Planning, on behalf of Crowdace Homes.
Morning, Gav Johns, Provision, on behalf of various clients. Morning, sir. Rupert Warren, KC, instructed by Litchfields for the North East Action Partnership.
Matthew Spry from Litchfields on behalf of the North East Action Partnership.
Good morning, sir. Chris Reed, ward member for Bucklebury for West Berkshire Council.
Good morning, sir. Andrew Black Consulting on behalf of Bucklebury Parish Council.
Good morning, sir. Councillor Simon Pike, representing Thatcham Town Council, and potentially also Simon Pike, individual representative. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Alan Diver, Walsingham Planning on behalf of the Colthrop Village Consortium.
Okay, thank you and welcome all. I think you were all here when we had the previous session, so you know how these things will work. Are there any procedural or general questions or points anyone wishes to make before I turn to the first agenda item? No, okay. Thank you. So I reordered these just to deal with some of the sort of things that I don't think will take very long to start with, and then we get on to the sort of more substantive issues further down the agenda. So the first action point just related to the detailed wording of policy SP17 relating to the housing mix on the site, and this the modification proposed. It just sort of brings it into line with policy SP18. So that's, I don't have any questions about that. Does anybody have any points or queries about that? No, okay, thank you. Energy efficiency. Well, we had a quite detailed discussion about policy SP5 and DM4. There was an action point. The modification now proposed takes out the detail from this policy relating to North East Thatcham and basically just says that the development would require an energy statement setting out measures to comply with or in accordance with policies SP5 and DM4. So that from my point of view, that's fine. It avoids sort of repetition or summary of something that's dealt with in more detail elsewhere and clearly brings it into the scope of this site. So your response to action point 37 and 38 was published at the end of last week in exam 39. They relate to the wording of policy DM4. And there's responses also provided clarification of the cost assumptions of meeting sustainable home standards used in the viability assessment. The modification to DM4 amends the requirement for space heat demand and sets out different standards for different house types. And that's based on further work. It's expressed in terms of the building regulations metric. It's based on the work by a regional who I know aren't here today. So don't worry, I'm not building up to a question about this. You're beginning to look a little bit worried. But I think just to say, well, one, I've not had time to think through that properly yet. But it may be a matter, when I've thought about it, that we may need to have a bit of a further discussion about. We have got 2 further reserve days in July. So just putting a marker down again that we may actually need to come back again. I'm not saying for definite, but it's just a possibility on that one. So I don't propose to discuss that at all today and what this policy says in terms of SP17, but obviously this site would be affected by how long the bell's going to be. Must be some. Okay. Obviously this site would be brought in. It would have to comply with the requirements set out in that policy. So I don't wish to discuss those now. But if you'll be aware that if you've got an interest in that, there may be a further opportunity for discussion depending on my consideration of that matter. Okay, so we'll move on to the next item, which is about what the revised policy says about flooding and water. And again, this is an issue that's cropped up. Just wait a minute. Is there a wedding on? Oh, that's a... It's all right. No, across the road. Yeah. No, don't worry. I imagine it's not going to go on all morning. But... Maybe it will. Okay. Anyway, hopefully you can hear me anyway. Okay, so the issue, this, basically, the council's proposed a modification to policy SP 17 and some additional reason justification. But the essence of this is an issue that's cropped up a number of times now, actually. This is suggesting on this site that there may need to be some phasing to allow upgrades to be made to water supply and wastewater treatment capacity. It's not saying there will be, but it's just flagging that up as a possibility, yeah? And that seems to be based on the evidence I asked you to, double check and look back on in response to another action point about policy DM7, which was the water cycle study and what Thames Water said in its regulation 19 representation. And that seemed to be saying, well, you can't actually look ahead over the full plan period to be certain about what upgrades may be needed, and therefore there may be a need for this. So essentially it's flagging that issue up. And you refer to the relevant PPG about that. Is there anything specific to this part of the district and Thatcham in particular that it's expected that this may be an issue, or is it's just the same as everywhere else? It's just there as a sort of a procedural realism, I suppose, that could occur.
Yes, that's correct. It's
Yeah.
just a.
But sorry.
It's just generally for
Yeah.
any development, just to make sure that those things are considered, but it's not considered to be a significant issue relating to the site.
No, okay. Your Thames Water, representation refers to the way that the legislation and the water companies are regulated, planning in 5-year periods. But the essence of this is that there isn't any significant capacity issue that's been identified. It's just that when you get to the relevant point when you're planning this, it could be that something needs to be phased. But is that, I mean, you've had discussion about the timing of development and the likely phasing, but that's not suggesting to you that there's likely to be a sort of a significant impact on the timing of this development?
No, that's right.
No, okay. Any observations from the partnership on this issue? No, okay. So your work hasn't revealed any significant capacity issues in terms of water supply, water treatment that you're expecting to have to deal with or wait for?
No, and if, I can't remember which annex it is, but in our development statement, which is an appendix to matter 4, there's a section dealing with utilities and water, and that reveals there's no issue.
Yeah, and that picked up on the work that the council did in the water cycle study and any further investigations that you've done with the relevant bodies. Okay. I know that the reason justification additional text has been added, and you've taken issue with some of it in terms of the background to the surface water flooding issues in Thatcham. I know what you put. Do you want to add anything further? Okay, thank you. Right. Can you hear me all right with the bells going? Yeah. Right, okay. Well, what do you want to have a short adjournment and see, or? I know you can't do anything about it, but yeah. Yeah. We mean to be suffocated from heat. Well, let's just have a, yeah. Let's just have a break for, time is it? Let's resume at 10 to, that's 7 minutes, okay? Thank you. Resume. On the issue of flooding and water and what the revised policy says, Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. We do have concerns around flooding and water, particularly surface water and foul drainage. I won't repeat what we've said. We're happy that you've taken on board our points on that already. Just in terms of the amendments to this policy, I think that in terms of the issues and the concern, that's captured in the new text that's added after paragraph 6.61 the council have put in there. And just draw your attention to a point in that the council referenced the number of flood attenuation ponds that have already been constructed on the site.
Yeah.
And that those are to be retained and enhanced in addition to suds to be provided on the site. There's also reference within the policy, new wording about details of the phasing of development to consider the likely upgrades that you've already referenced. I think for us, sir, this is about how that works within the master plan. And this is a theme that we'll potentially come back to around the way that would work. We see that as part of a master plan exercise in terms of drainage and that would have a considerable impact. So we would say that would need to be front loaded as part of that. But then I think what you would also need within this section of the policy and other bits is reference to that master plan and the outcomes of it for it to be properly referenced, because it's about the sequencing of what happens when.
Yeah, but that may apply to virtually all the preceding parts of the policy before you get to the new end section of master plan, wouldn't it? So I think I understand the point, the principle. I think how the mechanics of the policy is written and it works. So let's talk about that when we get to the master planning one. But I understand the point. There's quite a lot of fundamental things, aren't there, that need to be sorted out through the master planning process and then the application process. And then how that is then phased through conditions if necessary, which this is referring to, I think, in relation to this. So understood, yeah. Thatcham Town Council.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I'd like to draw your attention to our regular 19 representations at page 23, which was on water usage efficiency, which drew attention to the West Berkshire Water Study Cycle Phase 2, which is one of the documents in the evidence base, which said that this area is under serious water stress. As you recall, when we discussed the policy on water, I drew attention to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill and the impact of that on the ability to extract from the chalk. So while I'm not aware of any specific issues of water supply for this particular development, I think there are issues across the whole district which may impact on the ability to supply water to this site and require scheduling. Also, a comment on this question about upgrading the flood alleviation measures present on the site, which need to be retained, protected and enhanced. I believe that there are two, one of which is to do with the flood alleviation schemes which have recently been put in post 2007 flooding. And the second one, the older one, is related, I understand, to the water runoff from Flora Way. And when the second scheme was developed, I understand that it was not possible to enhance that one, the older one, to take account of that. So I'm not sure whether that it's practical to enhance the existing schemes to take account of this development. So thank you.
But I mean, understand the points, but they're both adequately covered by the way the policy is expressed, are they not? In terms of those things would have to be, the first one about water supply.
Yes.
I mean, Thames Water's advice at the moment is the water can be supplied, but there is a limit to what they can foresee, and therefore it is something that will need to be taken into account. And if necessary, the development would have to be phased. So that would, and similarly with the.
So yes, I agree. I think that the council was perhaps a bit optimistic about the general issues of water supply in their response just now. And the point I was making on the second one is that it says that the existing measures need to be enhanced, and I'm doubtful about the feasibility of that, given the information that I received through the planning process for those schemes. Thank you.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move on to the next item, which is the revised section on heritage and then specifically about what it now says about the existing listed buildings that are not well, actually within the allocation, but they're kind of inset from the allocation, if you see what I mean. So the wording has been amended to refer to development demonstrating how the setting of the nearby listed buildings will be conserved and harm to significance minimised. I'm just wondering whether the wording's quite right. It talks about conserving the setting and refers to harm to significance. Is that why is one referring to significance and one isn't, if you see what I mean? The conservation element is just referring to setting, whereas the harm element is to significance. Is that correct? And equally, how can there be conservation, but also some harm? But you're talking about minimising harm.
I don't think that's the meaning of it, I guess. Sorry, sir. We can go away and have another look at it.
I think
That isn't what it meant. It's to do with conserving and protecting the significance of the heritage asset and taking that into account with the rest of the development. That's what we're trying to achieve. But
So
yeah, we can take it away and have another look at wording that.
I mean, is it right to acknowledge there may be harm to either the significance of the building or to the setting, or?
I think you can acknowledge there could be harm and that needs to
But
be
shouldn't the aim be to
minimised.
conserve or enhance?
It should be, yes.
Yeah.
So we take on board the comment.
Yeah.
And we can have another go at the drafting of that wording to
Yeah.
ensure it's clearer.
Again,
and-
there's a long, complicated policies about listed buildings and
Yeah.
heritage assets elsewhere in the plan and in national policy. And the danger here is we're having a fourth set. We've got legislation, we've got NPPF, we've got the DM policies.
Policy SP9
And we've got SP9, and we've got something here. So I think probably the simpler it is expressed here, probably the better. I mean, what it's flagging up is that there are listed buildings that this development will be within the setting of, and therefore it's bringing into play the relevant policies. I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thanks, not wanting to repeat ourselves, but just going back to that master plan point, I do think that this is something that master plan could establish. So you could have, at the very least, the significance of those heritage assets and their setting established as part of the master plan. And I think it would be perfectly reasonable to just highlight that within this wording here, to when it talks about the setting and significance, just to make sure that it says which will have been established as part of the master plan exercise. And in terms of the impact, that would be something for the application, of course, but there's no reason why that couldn't be established at an early stage.
Yeah, understood. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So the listed buildings are, I think, but mainly farmhouses and certainly farm buildings, and their setting is farmland. And therefore, I don't know how the setting can be retained if the development proceeds to any meaningful extent. Thank you.
Any further points? Oh, yeah, Litchfields.
Yeah, thank you. I presume we'll come back to the, I suspect, recurring point that's going to be made about how the master plan is referenced in the policy. Just a simple suggestion around your point, sir, about whether you can conserve at the same time as harm, is whether you replace the word "and" with "or."
Yeah, okay, thank you. But we'll leave it with the council to have a think about how that's best dealt with. The key point being the acknowledgement that there are listed buildings there and this development would be within what is the setting identified now as the setting, I guess. Right, thank you. Let's move on then to this section on the green infrastructure. And I know I've got a separate section on the site plan, but obviously I think the way that this part of the policy is expressed and the significance of it in terms of the overall scheme, it brings into play the site plan here. So I think, we'll look at the plan and the Lichfield's alternative. We also have various other master plans, both in the Thatcham strategic growth study, and I'm aware of the subsequent plan in the Lichfield's Matter 4 statement, development statement in the concept master plan there, which again builds on the growth study plan, but so we've got various things there we can look at if necessary. But let me just go through then what my understanding of the modification, if we could, please. So this is under the heading green infrastructure. The first part, so it's been quite radically restructured following what I suggested in the action point and building in some other things. So the number of elements, policies SP10 and DM40 would be referred to in the first paragraph. The green infrastructure, the strategic bit of green infrastructure across the northern part of the site talks about landscape and biodiversity essentially, and then along with buffers with the ancient woodland. And it brings me back in reference to community park, which I'll ask you about shortly. And again, the concept of a buffer between the development, the adjoining countryside and the village of Upper Bucklebury. Details to be informed by the landscape and visual impact assessment. And again, the master planning process here is referred to. But in addition to that, there would be green infrastructure and open space within the developable area. And there'll be greenways linking through to existing rights and public rights of way network, etc. And specific reference to allotments, which was brought in when we discussed at the earlier sessions. It wasn't in the submitted plan, but we did have a discussion about it. And the town council advised that, well, that one, it's responsible, and two, it would support the provision of allotments here. Okay, so the first question I've got is it right for the first paragraph to refer to DM40? DM40 is essentially the quantitative requirements for public open space and the standards against the population. But that standard isn't relevant to the site as a whole, I don't think, is it? Because I mean, if you take the red line, I think you'd said that around 50% would be green infrastructure. So isn't the DM40 standard really applicable to the developable area rather than the site as a whole?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so there's a section in the green infrastructure bit about development within the developable area, green infrastructure in the developable area. I think, wouldn't that be where DM40 would be more appropriately referred to?
It can be, we can move it to the.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's just a matter of detail, really. So let's just talk about the green infrastructure on the higher part of the site. We had a discussion about this before, what was shown in the Thatcham strategic growth study, what that found, the contours. You clarified, I don't think you've significantly changed position in the terms of, it's slightly altered in terms of the way it's presented, and there's an alternative from the partnership, but you've provided a useful map which shows the contours, the pipeline, and you can therefore relate to how the lines are drawn for the green infrastructure there. So essentially it's the 105 contour line to the west and the 100-metre contour line to the east, but where the gas pipeline is lower than that, the line's drawn across along with the pipeline. And equally, if the 15-metre buffer from the ancient woodland comes below those contours, it extends it further south. So that's essentially it. And that would be a starting point for the master planning process. The partnership say, well, that's more rigid than the growth study. It talks about the contours being a soft constraint, more detailed skyline impact assessment analysis being required. Some could be a bit lower, some may need to be lower, some could go higher. I don't suppose you're disagreeing with that. It's just that it was where you're starting from.
Yes, and it's in the supporting text, we've made it clear that it's a starting point and it doesn't limit the development to below those lines, but that's where the starting point would be for those discussions through the LVIA and the planning application to take place. to actually provide where the northern limit of the development will go.
Yeah. If you look at your contours and the pipeline and the Thatcham growth study concept plan, that concept plan does seem to show development in areas that you have indicated as being the green infrastructure, yeah? Why was the Thatcham growth study showing development in those areas that now you're saying it may not be appropriate, or it needs at least further consideration?
I think we're just saying it needs further consideration. We're also, don't really want to see isolated development to the north of the site, which I think is what the growth study map shows. It shows just an area of development, which is to the north of the pipeline.
The Dunstan Park bit,
In a little, sorry.
the bit on the west, at the top
Yes.
of the. on the
And I think
west.
we would rather not see isolated areas of development within the development, actually, have a development as a whole, and then that green infrastructure is an area across the whole of the north of the site. That's what we would like to see.
Okay.
But it wouldn't prevent something else coming forward if necessary. And also the growth study looks at a much higher number on the site than we're currently considering.
Yeah.
So that's another reason just to sort of limit
Yes,
development to
okay.
the north.
In terms of the pipeline, you refer to a standoff from it or whatever. What is the distance that development would have to be kept away from that?
I'm not sure what it is. We can find out.
Okay.
If you would like us.
The reason I ask, I suppose, is because I think Lichfield may be able to answer. I mean, their concept master plan it appears to show development, broad areas of development straddling the pipeline. I suppose the thinking of that is that the pipeline and its buffer could be accommodated within that through layout of roads, open space, etc. Is that broadly that?
Exactly right. Sorry, I'm facing this way.
No, it's okay.
That's right. The growth study refers to the easement for the gas pipeline of 6 meters. So just for context, that's, the width of a very narrow road. And hence, it's difficult to imagine that development beyond the gas pipeline would by definition be isolated and would have to be limited in that way. And presumably that's why the growth study came to the conclusion in identifying some of those areas up the hill for development.
So your concept master plan showing those broad areas straddling the pipeline, you're saying that demonstrates that it wouldn't have to be isolated. It didn't, the pipeline doesn't need to separate out a different bit.
Exactly right. I mean, the use of infrastructure, green space woven through the development. There's loads of different ways that one could accommodate what's actually a relatively limited constraint within the form of development.
Okay, right, understood. But again, I suppose I think fundamentally the difference is how much development you're trying to accommodate on the site, isn't it? I mean, if you're looking to only accommodate 1,500 and you're saying that, well, the most appropriate areas for that are further south on the site, that's fine. If you're looking to squeeze more onto the site, well, you may revisit that and think about what different alternatives are, which is what the growth study did and what Lichfield have done, I suppose. So, yes, understood. In terms of this strategic green infrastructure across the northern part, higher parts of the site, in the submitted plan, there was reference to a community park, I think. We had some discussion about that. The modification originally removed reference to the community park. It's back in. There isn't any explanation, there's no mention of community park in the reason justification. The policy just refers to green infrastructure stroke new community park. What's the thinking then about that?
I think it's looking for an opportunity over that sort of northern green infrastructure area to provide open space that is publicly available for the community to use. The original submitted version included the idea of a country park.
Country park, yes.
Which it doesn't meet the definitions of a country park, but actually a community park might be it's an option for the development to, provide a community facility that is for that purpose rather than just green infrastructure. So sort of showing that actually it would be for public benefit rather than necessarily just for biodiversity or those sorts of things. It's the partnership were quite keen on it. They didn't object to us putting it back in. I think it just gives hopefully the community a bit more of an opportunity to see what could be on the site, but also to limit people may be travelling from the site to other areas such as Bucklebury Common for walking their dogs and things like that, just to kind of, you know, try and limit the impact the development might
Yeah.
have on the surrounding area.
I mean, the phrase multifunctional green space, I mean, that certainly encompasses public open space. But when we discussed before, I think the idea is that some parts would need to probably deter public access to prevent, you know, encroachment into the existing ancient woodland and things, or minimise, you know, and I suppose the idea of referring to a country park, it sort of implies something a bit more formalised than just informal green infrastructure, i.e. there may be some paths and signposts and things like that. That's the thinking, is it, I suppose, to keep it as a sort of, yeah, okay. Well, that's fine. Anything Litchfields want to add on that, and then I'll bring in others. No, okay. Right, Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So firstly, I've been unable to find any evidential base within the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study for the specific areas. If you find that there's within that, there's some sketch maps which were drawn in the highly unsatisfactory workshop. So I think very little weight can be given to the specific information in that document about the areas that were being considered there, because there's no justification within that document. And as you say yourself, that was based on 2,500 houses. So I would suggest, and we'll come back to this when we get to the references to the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study within the supporting text. But in this particular case, I think there is no evidential base. And on the pipeline, I think it's mentioned in the text, but there's no specific discussion of its location. There was much more discussion about the oil pipeline, certainly at the time of the workshop. So there, I think the point there is that very little weight can be given to the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study in terms of its relevance to the current plan. Thank you. Thank you, sir. So I'm putting on a different hat here as chair of the Mid and West Berkshire Local Access Forum, which is a bit of a strange beast because it's not a...
Just say that again.
The Mid and West Berkshire Local Access Forum, that's a body established under the Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000. It's not a statutory consultee, but if it chooses to comment, the council is required under that act to have regard to its views. And obviously, we would be interested in the nature of this country park. The local access forums, in case you're not aware, were originally established to have responsibility for rights of way, but they were subsequently broadened to cover all forms of access to land except for motor vehicles on highways and byways. So we would obviously have an interest in making comments on this, and we'll come back to that under the process for the development of this, that where the opportunity for us and other similar bodies to make input into the development of the very general concepts at the moment. And I just mention at this point that it's unclear to me what is meant by a greenway, how that differs from a public right of way, and there are lots of ambiguities about what is meant, and you've highlighted some of them, but it's not clear what is meant by the green infrastructure in specific terms in this policy. Thank you.
I mean, my understanding is, I mean, there are obviously some existing public rights of way across the site. This seems to be suggesting that these would be protected and enhanced, and that there would be new links to them through greenways. I don't suppose you can necessarily talk about them being public rights of way, but I mean because that's a separate. The planning concept is that it's a you know, multi-use, pleasant place to walk, joining into the existing footpaths. I mean, I don't suppose you've got any issue with that.
The point that I had, I think I might have mentioned it in representations, is that Wokingham Borough Council has a very specific meaning for it. Has a policy relating to the development of greenways, which will be inconsistent with them being developed on this site. Because they are in West Wokingham, they are connections between development sites. So that's one of the reasons why I was unclear as to what was meant and what would be meant by new public rights of way. Because if they are surfaced paths, then they probably wouldn't be public rights of way. But normally, I'm going to a sort of a lengthy discussion of public rights of way, how they're established, but it seems odd to create new ones in the context of what is being proposed. There might be other forms of access, but I didn't understand that part of the policy. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. I think our only concern on this is that we recognise that the map that the councillor put in is indicative. Our thought process is that there is likely going to need to be more green infrastructure on site than just that area around the north, and it wouldn't need to just be limited to that. So, for instance, going back to the heritage assets, if you've got a setting there, that setting and how that kind of standoff might work, that would probably be best served as green infrastructure as well. And equally, the gas pipeline is not the only constraints on sites. We talked about it before. There's the oil pipeline along the frontage of the site, which is going to have another constraints. And equally, just around the edge of the site, particularly as you come up Floral Way, those roads around there between the existing Thatcham settlement have a kind of semi-rural feel to them. So you'd want to retain that rural feel. So I think that we would want the green infrastructure to just be limited to that area. And I think there'd need to be some sort of recognition that I think it's clear that it's indicative, but the overall areas of green infrastructure will continue to evolve as master plan comes through.
I mean, in the modified policy, there is a specific bullet point that says green infrastructure and open space within the developed parts of the site, in addition to the community park. So that, other than beginning to show those areas on the map, which is getting into a level of specificity that may not be possible at this stage in advance of the master planning process, I'm not sure what more the policy could say.
I think there's just the thought process that there's more detail still to go through as part of the master plan process to establish the developable area of the site. And it would need to be, I think we wouldn't want it to be read that the developable area is everything outside of what's shown on this map. And I'm not suggesting that it does say that. The council are clear that that's an indicative policy, but I think the policy could go further. And again, not wanting to be a broken record, it goes back to the master planning process and how that evolves as a developable area, and then what that means for green infrastructure.
Understood. Thank you. Town council again.
Yeah, thank you. Just a point of clarification, there's been numerous references to the oil pipeline. There are in fact two pipelines. In some places they are one very close to each other. In other places they are separated. I think for the majority of this site they're separated, and therefore the buffer would need to be to each of them, and therefore it's wider than the number that's been quoted. That may be a detail, but it's something that is overlooked. Thank you.
Okay. And presumably that's 6 metres either side as well.
It's either side of either of the pipelines.
Yes.
So yes.
Okay, Lichfield's.
Okay, I think the discussion we've just had from various participants points to the basic problem, sort of almost conceptually, with how the plan that's been prepared by the council is being interpreted, because it has your request in action point 22 was so that it's more diagrammatic with a less precise boundary. And in the sense, the issue is the plan isn't very diagrammatic and does appear to have a precise boundary, and which is why I think we would sort of commend to you the either of the examples that we've provided in our position statement, which I think sort of reflects the spirit in which the plan is intended to serve within the plan, as in within the local plan, and provides the sort of room to, in a sense, address all of these issues through the master plan and planning application process.
So your plan with the sort of green zebra style stripes, coming down from the north, is less hard edge.
Yes, it's been given various names through its iteration. Slinky zebra, I think, is the sort of but yeah, I think that the clear point being that it has sort of blurred edges, just to reflect the fact that in different parts of the site one might interpret how far into or up the slope one would go with development and versus the design of the green space.
We're leaving aside. Sorry.
No, so I'm going to say, so I think some of the debate in the sense has been had around the way the plan is at the moment, showing some constraints and some parameters for how one, like the contours and so on, might define the edges, is automatically leads the reader of the plan to interpret in a more precise way than is actually intended by the document, in light of the fact there will be a master plan and planning application process to define the specific extent of development.
I mean, leaving aside how the edge of the line is drawn, i.e. not drawn in your example, or is the main areas that seem to be different would be at the sort of the northwest corner. And I think these really reflect the pipeline areas. There would be less green infrastructure up at the northwest corner and the central part of the site, and then around Calthrop Manor, which again reflects your sort of concept plan where you think development could go further in those directions.
Yes, I mean, that's right. I mean, I think the starting point is there is actually a reasonable level of similarity between the two, but those are the areas of difference, and that flows from the preliminary work that we did on skyline analysis to basically give us the confidence that development could go further up the slope, and indeed, you know, reflects to a degree what the Thatcham Growth Study found as well.
And it's based on that's what you identify as being an appropriate developable area along that sort of broad line that you say that there is capacity for 2,500.
Yeah.
Again, going back to what the growth study, I suppose, but if it wasn't 2,500, would the natural thing more likely be that the development wouldn't go as far north? Or you can't necessarily say because.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, I think, well, if one were to build less homes on the totality of the site, I mean, setting aside the point about school space and all that, then would you have less developable area, or would you build it at a lower density?
Well, yeah.
But I suppose the key, this really goes to the essence of soundness, because what is common ground, isn't it? And I think from the council, that the reason they've defined their area is because they want to provide less homes on the site. And we've got a specific policy requirement in the NPPF, para 124 of the September iteration, that policy should make efficient use of land. So this is a suitable site for development of a mixed-use urban extension. It's common ground, certainly with the council, that it can accommodate 2,500 homes. And the policy requires that when you allocate a site and make a suitable development, that you should make, you know, effective use of it, efficient use of it, you know, partly through, well, it essentially refers to densities, but in densities is both gross densities and net densities. So if we have a site that's suitable for development for providing housing, and there's no evidence to say that it has to be limited to 1,500, what is the policy justification for not making the most effective and efficient use of the site to meet housing needs for this plan period and potentially beyond?
Yeah, understood. So your basic point is that the red line is what the council submitted. The figure isn't in effect consistent with that, I think is basically the way you're putting it. So it's not that the plan submitted is unsound in terms of the allocation. It's just that there's an inconsistency between the two. The evidence, the red line and the number.
In essence, yes. I mean, it goes to all the evidence as we've relayed at length for this site to accommodate 2,500. It can accommodate 2,500. Council doesn't disagree with that. And we haven't really heard a basis for why it should be limited to less.
Understood. Okay, thank you. Right. We're going to come back obviously to the master planning and all those sort of things, but specifically on the wording of the policy on green infrastructure and the maps that we've got designating the sort of the indicative area of it. Is there anything further anybody wishes to say before I just come back to the council to make any final comments on that? There's detailed wording in there that Bucklebury Parish Council haven't talked about it was reference to Upper Bucklebury you had some issues when we discussed it before about the relationship between development and the village and the countryside and the ancient woodland, which I think has been addressed. You're nodding, so I think those sort of concerns that you raised previously, I think have been addressed. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, goes without saying, sir, you've heard our concerns before on these matters, but on a without prejudice basis, we're satisfied that these sorts of amendments do assist with the concerns that we raised before.
Through the master planning process. Yeah. Okay. Right. Thank you. Anything further on green infrastructure that the council wishes to say? No. Okay. Right, thank you for that. So let's come on to the next agenda item then, which is community infrastructure. Again, there's a discrete part of the policy that deals with this, and there's a number of different elements to it. Well, I'll deal with the secondary school as a separate item. So this essentially is community infrastructure in general. And then I'll deal specifically with the primary school, early years provision and healthcare, and then we'll separately come on to the secondary school. So the modification, I can't actually recall how it was expressed originally, but we've got the track changes. Anyway, it starts off with a range of community facilities will be provided to serve the development. So that seems to relate, it brings the provision of the community infrastructure, it seems to suggest it's there to serve the housing development. My understanding, and if you read paragraphs 652, 656, 661 in the plan, just going back to fundamentals about Thatcham, the background in previous plans, the core strategy, and this plan, and the justification for a strategic allocation. It seems to be part of that is that social infrastructure and regeneration in Thatcham town are existing problems, and there needs to be an improvement in those regards. So it seemed to be suggesting that this strategic site isn't residential led, which is now gone. It isn't just a housing development that has ancillary or incidental community infrastructure to serve it. It's a package of things that will help regenerate the town and provide social infrastructure improvements that are needed already. Is that true? Is this proposal for something more than just housing development with serving community infrastructure?
Yes, so it's looking to provide the residential development and then the opportunities to provide the community facilities for the development. And if there's opportunities within Thatcham, the development could help to make improvements to the town as a whole as well. That's what, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be sorted out, but it gives the opportunities for those things to be considered, and where the best use of facilities are, whether that's on the site or off the site. It may be that it is the best place on the site for the facilities. It could be that actually some facilities are better placed within the town centre of Thatcham as part of the improvement of the Thatcham town centre itself.
So when the plan talks about existing social infrastructure, capacity issues, I suppose, what specifically are we talking about? What's the social infrastructure that needs improving, upgrading, enhancing, or whatever it is, increasing in capacity in the town? What are we actually talking about, irrespective of the development? If part of the justification of this strategic is to do something in that regard, what specifically are we talking about?
If Thatcham is subservient to Newbury, and I think the idea is to try and make it maybe slightly more independent, improve the facilities in the town centre so people don't travel to Newbury for certain services and facilities and things like that. It's a very small town centre, and with limited opportunities, so this can offer opportunity to improve what's there, but also provide new things that would mean that the people of Thatcham aren't travelling out of Thatcham for certain facilities.
Okay, well, let's go through each of the items and see to what extent. I suppose going back to my query, is it right that the range of community facilities will be provided to serve the development? I mean, do you need those words in, or is the proposal to deliver a range of community facilities, and actually it's to serve the development and the wider community? I think that's fundamental.
We can definitely take that away and consider it.
I think this seems to, I mean, leaving aside what developer contributions and what the housing developers are expected to fund, because I think that's probably slightly different. It'll come into focus, I think, when we talk about the secondary school, actually. what, you know, is this a package of development that's a sort of mixed use development that's got various components to it? Or is it a housing development that will just provide what it needs and fund what it needs to support it? It's which of the two is it?
I think it's clear it will be additional because of the things that we're proposing, like the healthcare. You know, we're proposing that potentially that would be a building on site. So yes, there's some additional elements to this as well. But you know, in terms of the actual contributions and where they'd go, that would be a you know, discussion further down the line. But I think there's certainly elements of this development where there's a wider contribution.
Okay. Well, let's go through them, because I think the danger is that if the broad concept is it's community facilities that are not just to serve the development, but they're going to be provided, that's fine. It doesn't need to be reined in, because it's not just about defining what the housing developers will fund, if you see what I mean. That's my kind of reading of what this wording is sort of probably doing. It's sort of, do you understand that? I'm probably not explaining very well, but I think
No, we understand. I think we were trying to respond to your action point that talked about changing those wordings. We're more than happy to take out the sentence about providing to serve the development and just a range of community facilities. That's fine. We had considered proposing amendments to the first paragraph of the policy about meeting the needs of the development and things that, you know, taking place across the whole site. It's not in the wording you've got at the moment, but we can provide that, which might then just help to clarify kind of what the development is trying to do and how it's going to do it. So we can provide that additional wording to you.
Okay, well, let's
so then you can have a look at that. We can get that.
Because I think there are two different things, aren't there? There's one, what the housing developers will fund, and there's two, what actually is being proposed and as part of this overall development. So, and yes, I mean, and I think when we spoke before, and we'll go back through some of these, we talked about the community centre before, and you talked about, I think, there being a shortage of community centre in Thatcham, and therefore something on this site could actually provide a facility for the wider community. Equally, we're going to talk about healthcare again in a minute, but I mean, that clearly was a facility that would not just serve the residents, it would be a new, if it was on site, it would be a new health centre that would serve the wider. So two examples already of where it's actually, I can see that it's got those wider, but that doesn't mean that the developer would have to fund all of those things necessarily. Okay, right, I'll leave that with you then, just to think about that fundamental point. So the healthcare. So yes, so going back to what the policy as modified says now, it doesn't specify that it would be on site or indicate where the land and or the build costs would be met by the developer. The reason justification seems to suggest it may not be on site. This is back to there's still a feasibility study, etc.
Yes, so it goes back to that feasibility study that's being carried out. I think the hope is it could be on site, but they're recognising that if it can't be on site, then that's what would need to be done. And a new feasibility study would need to be done to demonstrate how that healthcare provision would be met. But the aim is to have something on site, is my understanding. The ICB have been involved, they've helped reword that, and they have agreed with the wording, they're happy with that. We do have a letter from them, which we can submit to you if that would be helpful.
Well, I'll have a think about that. But either way, this new facility would be provide capacity to serve the additional residents, but it would also be an opportunity to provide additional capacity to meet the current shortages.
That's correct. Yes.
And so an extra funding would be needed. And that's where I think the original wording that the ICB was suggesting, I think, is now gone, isn't it? So, and so this is an acknowledgement that there would need to be public funding or whatever the funding is through healthcare to make this achievable. And that's the feasibility study.
That's my understanding, yes.
And is that consistent with the viability assessment? I can't remember, you probably spoke about this before, but how does that relate to the assumptions in the viability assessment?
I would need to check that. I don't know off the top of my head.
Oh. In terms of the primary school, on the basis of 1,500, it'd be one school, I think, wouldn't it? I think the 2,500 scheme had two primary schools.
That's correct.
And the modification now would be that the early years provision and the primary school would be, you brought them together. Is that a sense because it would be the same building or buildings?
It's likely to be
Yeah.
the same
And that would be on site and that would be to meet the needs
of the development.
of the development,
specifically.
yeah. In terms of you considered what I was, just my suggestion, the action point following the previous discussion about the bullet points relating to open space. You deleted one of the final bullet points in this section because it's dealt with under the green infrastructure. But you retained reference to outdoor formal and informal sports pitches and areas for community use in this part. Again, and you've said because, well, you've added the words for community use. So it comes under the community heading, but doesn't all the green infrastructure, or a lot of it would be for community use. I still don't quite follow why you've got something in here and how it relates to the subsequent long section on green infrastructure.
I think the aim is that these, although yes, they do count as green infrastructure, that they are specific to be sports pitches and things, and therefore, while it might come out of your GI sort of calculation, actually they are a very specific thing that we want to see. It's not necessarily, it's a specific infrastructure to include for the community rather than just being part of the green infrastructure.
Would these formal and informal sports pitches, if there was a secondary school on site, would they be those pitches or would they be?
They could be, and that would be a discussion that would need to take place at the planning application stage.
But they would contribute towards the green infrastructure bullet points includes green infrastructure and open space within developed parts of the site. Yep. And I think you said, well, that's where you could refer to DM40. But isn't that where the sports pitches and formal and informal sports pitches would fall within that clause?
Yeah, and we can move it if you would like us to. We just thought it would make it clearer that it was part of the community facility provision rather than green infrastructure. But if it fits best, then we are happy to move it.
My understanding fundamentally is that the buffer, the green infrastructure, whatever it is, the 70 hectares or whatever it is across the north is something, but that doesn't, but in addition to that, DM40 and all the usual policies for the developable area would apply. So within the developable area, you get what you would, if you ignored that green infrastructure outside the developable area, you'd still be looking for everything you would normally do on a housing development on the developable area, including DM40 and for a scale of this development, sports and sports
Yes,
pitches,
that's
etc. Yeah. Okay, right. Well, I'll have a think. But I understand the concept. But they would they in quantitative terms they count towards the DM40 standards,
Yes,
don't they?
they do.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Anything? I'll come to the parish council and town council. But anything Litchfields want to say about this part of the policy, community infrastructure?
Sorry. Not particularly. I mean, I think we agree the distinction between what's provided on site as opposed to what's funded, I think is a helpful one. And we agree with just deleting to serve the development off that first sentence is probably the helpful way to go. You asked a question, I think, about the funding of the primary healthcare.
Yes.
The viability assumes that it's funded through SIL.
All of it.
It says assumed funded through SIL.
So the housing developer for this site would make a SIL, would have to pay SIL.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't be expecting to make a planning obligation contribution for the health centre as well, because that's one of the things that SIL funds in West Berkshire.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay.
And obviously, without making a sort of hackneyed point, you get more SIL 2.5 than you do at 1.5. But yeah, that's essentially it would be for the management of the SIL pot to allocate the funds accordingly.
So the SIL and then any other public funding that would need to match it to bring that forward. Yeah.
The for the reference, it's the tables D and E in the appendix 1 of the whole plan viability work. It's
Yeah,
got those
okay.
references.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so just to go back then, you agree that the site may accommodate social infrastructure that goes over and above what would needed simply to serve the residents, but that's different from what the policy is requiring the housing developer to financially contribute towards.
That's correct. And
to put it the other way around, the development package as a whole isn't limited to what could be funded by the housing developer.
no, that's
No.
correct. And this goes back to the Thatcham growth study in terms of the evidence base. There's a reference on so I'm just trying to collapse my entire session. There's a reference, I think it's at 3 point yeah, sorry, 4.23 of the Thatcham growth study, which is on page 70, which basically says that North East Thatcham has the potential to deliver significant new social infrastructure that will support the new residents of the development and enhance provision in the existing town. So going back to the sort of fundamental essence of what it's done. So it's important that the policy doesn't limit itself to only providing in the master plan what's required to meet the needs of the development, but obviously for policy and legal compliance reasons, the financial contribution would have that.
So hence the need for this whole site, if it's going to be developed in the way that the policy is proposing to do what it's the strategic justification for it will need public funding in one form or another to deliver it, because the house builders can't deliver all of the social infrastructure that the policy is proposing.
Well, I don't think you could necessarily conclude that. So at the moment, you've got SIL funding as a availability, which is pooled. And then for other infrastructure, it comes, we'll have the debate about the secondary school and so on, but conceptually what we're not assuming for other 106 contributions that there's a sort of flat roof tax that's only based on funding.
No, okay.
So the secondary school debate, I don't preempt it, but
Yeah.
Secondary school is classrooms and then central facilities. And if the need of the development was in a sense of half a secondary school, we wouldn't only pay for half a hall if, effectively you needed to provide some central facility to do that. So, and equally, if the unit of delivering a certain sort of unit of provision is greater than the minimum size generated by the residents of the development, then you might end up providing more proportionately of that. But it does go fundamentally to, I guess, the calculation of the amount of SIL that was quite, a reasonable amount of the provision here is to be funded by SIL, as you can see from tables D and E of the viability study, that the exercise of whether there will be enough money in the SIL pot, is a matter to be answered by the council, but self-evidently there'll be more money in that pot the more homes that are built on the site. And that if public funding was required, then obviously the amount of public funding would be less with more houses.
Yeah, okay.
Repeating that point, but it's an important one.
Okay, thank you. Right, Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. I think the concern we have is that previously the policy was quite specific in terms of the requirements for that community use. We've heard the conversations about it, but clearly that you're right, it's not, in terms of, there's a question around what the developer will fund.
Sorry, which community use are we talking
In
about?
terms of sports pitches or the overall community indoor facility, so
Yeah.
both of those aspects. But there's also a spatial aspect to that in terms of how that is incorporated on the site. There's reference within the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study as well around the difficulty of potentially accommodating that in terms of large sports pitches on the site because of the contours. It's not very flat. So there's again, goes back to the master planning exercise of how that's done. I think also within this, in terms of the healthcare facility, in terms of those community indoor facilities, there's no reference to phasing and how that would work either. There is reference to phasing for the other requirements in terms of infrastructure. So I think that would be a key aspect of at what point does that come through, and consideration towards the phasing of that to ensure that that is going to serve the community at large. Thank you.
So what you have in mind there is, well, is there some phasing mechanism to ensure that, say, the indoor community centre and the sports pitches are provided before X number of the homes are built? Whatever.
Yeah, and that clearly is something that the policy would need to reference in terms of that exact mechanism. That is something for later on, I accept, but I think we'd want to see consideration of that, and particularly on the healthcare, primary healthcare. Again, if that was to go off site, or even if it was on site as well, the timing of that in terms of delivery will be critical.
Okay. Right, that's from Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So I'll first respond to the comments made by Lichfield before moving on to the comments I was making before. I don't understand how a health centre can be funded through SIL for two reasons. Firstly, that we've already established that the health centre is required in its entirety very early in the development because a health centre has to have a specific size to be viable, and there's no capacity in the existing health centres in Thatcham for growth. Secondly, a health centre is a GP practice, which is a private business. It is funded publicly, but it is not a public service in the sense as a hospital is. And therefore, I'm not sure that it is possible for SIL to fund that. And of course, the problem with SIL is that it is paid on delivery, on completion. And therefore, there wouldn't be the money to build the health centre at the outset when it is needed. So for those two reasons, particularly for the health centre, I don't understand how SIL can provide the health service, the health facilities in a way which is sound according to the plan.
Okay, well, I'll maybe let the council respond, but I mean, my understanding of SIL is that it's a tax and that the council has a pot of money. It doesn't have to wait for, it's not like a planning obligation where it's waiting for the house builders here to pay for the health centre. It's got a pot of SIL that it could use for this.
The question is, can the council pay for the premises for what is a private business, which is what a GP practice is?
I'll let the council, I suspect the answer is yes to that, but I'll let the council answer that. Let's go back. And sorry, Thatcham Town Council, have you anything further?
I was going to go through the individual items in that community.
Yeah,
so if you
both
want.
well, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So
some of them we've talked about before. And
so yeah, so I'm going to the question is about which are on site and which are off site, because the wording is each item seems to have an individual way of describing it. So we've got local centres. I assume that a corner shop will be on site. Small scale employment, it's worth recalling that the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study included within its area what is now described as policy size ESA 1. And at that time, it was considered that the small scale employment would be on that site, which of course is off the site of what is now North East Thatcham. So that would probably be satisfactory, but putting it off site in Thiel or Membury would not be. So that is it. There's two halves there, one of which needs to be actually on site and the other one to be within sustainable travel distance. So the primary healthcare facility, there is a belief that it can be on site. I've mentioned before about the proposed development at Walnut Close, which unfortunately was not public information at the time we made our representations in response to your questions, but I've mentioned it before. That includes the other healthcare facility in Thatcham, the Thatcham Medical Practice. So there might be a potential for that one to grow instead. So that one while the likelihood is that it will be on site, there is a potential for it to be off site. The early years and primary provision explicitly states it's on site. The secondary school doesn't explicitly state, but if you're providing land, which is a requirement, then it would be on site. Though I note that some of the options for
I'll come back to second.
no, I'm just going to make one point there. It says it would be on site, though the options for the study, which we'll come back to, include options which are off site. So there's an inconsistency between the study and the policy. Then the question about we've got the community indoor facility. And I mentioned before again that this potential development in the centre of Thatcham, Walnut Close and Brownsfield Road, which might be provide that benefit for the residents of North East Thatcham, but make it more generally useful because it could be part of a wider facility rather than yet another community hall for which Thatcham is already over provided. And indeed, in terms of indoor sports, we have one which is almost redundant because it was built on site, and we didn't want to repeat that. Outdoor formal and informal pitches, I would suggest those need to be treated differently as well, because informal pitches need to be close for people to knock about football. Formal pitches require changing rooms and supervision, and therefore they're more effective if they are consolidated. Indeed, the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study explicitly mentioned off-site provision at Henwick Worthy. I think the particular suggestion that they made in that, speaking here as a member of the Henwick Worthy Joint Management Committee, I believe that the specific proposal that was made was not sound, but I think that there, again, as far as formal pitches is concerned, having just one or two with all of the overhead of the changing rooms and the supervision might not be the best solution. So I think that there needs to be more specificity about which of these are explicitly on site and which are potentially on or off site as to meet the best needs of the residents of this development and the wider Thatcham community. Thank you, sir.
Understood. Councillor Reid.
Sorry. I think what I'd like to bring up, sir, is really echoing what Simon said, but it is what residents are telling me, either on the doorstep or in one-to-one surgeries or just answering doorstep questionnaires that I hand out. So the concerns, and that's really it. How is this policy answering these questions? And I'm looking at the residents and I'm going, actually, I don't know how it is answering those questions. And they've got questions on pressure on education, not only of the tired and cramped site of Kennet Secondary School in Thatcham itself, built in the 50s, which is well oversubscribed now, I think by 695 pupils, I think was the last count. But also the future of the much-loved Church of England Primary School in Buckbury, which has got a long life in it, but it does take a lot of children from North East Thatcham itself. Ensuring that early years is not just an add-on, but is considered and delivered compliant with the government's aims for wraparound care, which is now 52 weeks of the year, not just term time, and fully compliant with Ofsted guidelines. So it's not just an add-on, it's not just an extra classroom. If you're going to have free flow, they need to be able to run from inside to outside all the time. You need huge amounts of storage space to be able to keep all those toys and various other things and educational bits and pieces, as well as having separate toilets, because obviously they're much smaller than us, medical waste to be taken away, and the fact that actually early years has a significant number of SEND children who require one-to-one care as well. And I think what the residents are looking for, and I don't think this policy necessarily addresses it, is the flexibility to have a quality of education infrastructure, including increasing needs of special education needs and disabilities children, that will attract the next generation of highly motivated teachers to Thatcham and retire the very now tired Kennet School. It's done its job, and now it's time to move on and release the site for future needs in central Thatcham. An end-to-end education that will allow the community to flourish without having to commute from one end of the Thatcham-Newbury-Theale corridor. We often see children being commuted from one end of Field, Thatcham, going to St Bart's, commuted all the way back. But actually that there is sufficient facilities within the education to cover the needs of the vast majority of the children. And the very fact that we've got special education needs increasing as the rest of the country has as well. And they can be addressed within this community without having to go to the other ends of West Berkshire. And then finally on the healthcare infrastructure, I know we moved on about that, but we do have an increasingly aging population in West Berkshire. And again, attracting highly qualified and motivated healthcare professionals to the area by having the quality facilities that their career, that will allow their careers to flourish. I think, that's very much the message I'm hearing from
Okay, no, thank you, that's helpful. I'm going to talk about the secondary school and the special education needs provision later, so we'll come back to some of what you mentioned there. Thank you. Lichfields, on this section on community infrastructure.
Yeah, just a reference that hopefully is a helpful response to Mr. Pike's question earlier on. If you look at the regulation 123 list for SIL for West Berkshire, under health, among the items to be funded by SIL in the 123 list is health centres, stroke doctors, surgeries. And it goes on to list some of the other social infrastructure as well that's covered by SIL.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. So that means it's within the scope of what the council has said it will spend SIL on. Yeah. Okay, right. Do you want to come back on any of those? In terms of, maybe two things. The way the policy is expressed in terms of honour on off-site provision for the different components. I think maybe it might be just helpful just to run through and just to clarify what the intention is, whether there's flexibility or where it's clear it's on site. And secondly, the issue about the funding of the health centre, the viability assessment and SIL. Do you want to just do that?
I think in terms of the community facilities, we wouldn't want to be too specific in the policy because we want to allow for flexibility at the planning application stage and through the master planning and all the work that's going to take place to discuss with the community where they want the facilities. That, as has been said, there's no point putting something on the site if it's not going to be used by the community. I mean, yes, a local centre, you would expect that to be on the site, which include retail. And we potentially can propose an amendment that says rather than small scale employment, talks about small scale business uses. That might give a bit more flexibility to that element of the policy. The healthcare, again, there's a feasibility work that's going on to determine whether that needs to be on-site or off-site, and we can't prejudge that. Primary and early years would need to be on-site. A primary school will have to have an early years provision within it, but equally you can have early years provision elsewhere on the site. The policy, we don't feel precludes that taking place. We're going to talk about secondary schools separately in a minute. Again, like the community indoor facility, again, that could be something on site. It could be something that is funded off site or financial contributions towards an existing facility somewhere else. We don't really want to be specific about that. And again, the informal and informal sports pitches, as has been discussed, there is the Hennick-worthy sports pitches. It's possible that rather than something on site, money could be put towards improvements on that, which is off site. So I don't think we want to be really specific in the policy as to where those things are going to go, because we want to be able to have those discussions later on as to where the best place for those things are. They are needed to meet the needs of the development, but whether on-site or off-site is the best place for those, that's for another stage of the plan process.
Okay, understood. I mean, I suppose when you read the policy, you kind of assume that the policy is proposing a range of development within a red line allocation. It's a sort of mixed use development, and these things will be provided. That's the way you would read it. Council reads residents would probably probably understand it. The way you've described it is that on some of them, so I mean, basically the indoor community centre, the healthcare facility, and the sports pitches, come on to the secondary school, could all be on site or off site, I think.
I mean, I think the intention is that we would like to have them on site, but actually if there's no demand or no need for them on the site, then you wouldn't request them to be on the site. If they're needed at all. I mean, the idea is the development provides the facilities for the community. And that is the intention, but it does need to be discussed through the master planning and at the planning application stage as the best way to provide those facilities.
Okay, so things to sort out through the master plan. Fine, we'll come on to that process and what that will entail shortly. What time is it? Is there anything else on the SIL and the health centre? The way that SIL works and what's in scope, what isn't, and what the funding may be or may not be available. Do you want to just respond to that?
So Mr. Spry referred to the 1, 2, 3 list, which I won't go back over, but in terms of the law, section 216 of the 2008 Planning Act sets out what infrastructure includes. It's not an exhaustive list, but it does set out at section 216 2D medical facilities, and there's no restriction on what a medical facility is or isn't, and there's no restriction on whether it's a private business or any other form of institution, as it were.
And your understanding now that Ms. Spry's reminded you is that the VA assumes that the health centre would be funded through SIL.
That is what's
Or
in
partly funded through
yeah,
SIL.
that's what's in the viability assessment.
Or to put it the other way around, the viability assessment doesn't assume any financial contribution through section 106 from the house builder.
No.
Yeah, okay. So the funding would have to be found for the health centre, which is what we discussed the other day. I mean, when we were back in May, and one of the sources is SIL, and there are potentially other sources.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Fine. Okay, well, I can have a think about, you know, what you've said and what's intended through. It's this mix again of what the plan is proposing to be built on the allocation and what the plan is proposing is needed to be funded by house builders to meet its own needs and potentially to meet shortfalls already existing. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So just briefly to get back on one of your previous comments about community use of school pitches. Grass pitches have a limited capacity because they wear out, so that it's the experience is that they're not frequently available. Grass pitches not widely available for use at school ones because they have their capacity for school use. Artificial pitches is different, but they are only for formal use because they require care in their use, and if they leave them open, they'll get damaged. So Hennick is at full capacity. The ground is fully utilised. The comment that was made in the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study is, I believe, a mistake based on a misunderstanding. But it might be possible to move artificial pitches there or create them if grass pitches could be found elsewhere. Subject, I would have to say, to planning applications on noise and light, which is an issue which there's been objections to past applications. So it's not straightforward, but I think that it would be unwise to assume automatically that school facilities can be used by the community without detailed consideration. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to have a break now. The next we're going to talk about secondary school, and then, if necessary, the implication of that for the sports pitches we can cover again. But understood the points made. Okay, let's break there until 11:20, and then we'll resume and look at the secondary school, and then see how we get on in terms of the further items before the lunch break. Thank you. move on to the next agenda item, AP 25, relating to the secondary school provision. So the modification to SP 17 relating to the secondary school and special educational needs provision refers to the provision of land and a financial contribution from the developer. The reason justification says that it is expected land will be required on site, but then the response to the AP 25 sets out a number of different options that could be provided to provide the additional capacity and additional special needs provision. And that could be a whole new school on site, a remodeling of an existing secondary school site, or a sixth form centre. Does that mean on site? Yeah. And provision of special needs accommodation on site. So would that be a separate special needs facility?
It could be, and that's something that the feasibility study will need to consider is the
Right.
scope for that.
Is that, I don't know about educational policy, but is that something that is in line with, you know, DfE guidance, whatever?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. Right, so there's the options. And yeah, okay, fine. The existing situation is that the Kennet School, the schools are at capacity broadly.
They currently are at capacity. Pupil numbers are declining.
Yeah.
So it's hard at this stage to say what the position will be at the stage of an application, and that's where the feasibility study comes in to look at those, you know, the detailed figures at that stage. Yeah.
So at the moment, schools at capacity, but we're thinking about a few years ahead, so we don't actually know whether there'll be capacity there, and then what would be the preferred option. Okay, so fine. When would this feasibility study then start taking place?
I think as soon as it can do, really, it's quite fundamental to everything else that's going on. We don't have a timescale in mind at the moment, but it would be as soon as we can get one started, when we know, you know, the numbers for the site and
Yes, okay.
those sorts of things need
Right.
to be firmed up before we can start that work.
But it's a bit of work that would be done then, you know, within, you know, it's an important bit of work that needs to be done early on. So it'd be starting from a position that we're broadly at now, i.e. Capacity, but presumably projections can be made about future numbers, and you said they're declining. So it's just a matter of saying, taking stock, you know, in a month's, year's time about what that is showing.
That's correct.
Yeah. But the thinking at the moment is, well, there will need to be more capacity. That's an assumption.
That's the
Yeah.
at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Right, if we look then, so understood that there's uncertainty about, you know, numbers and things. What the different scales of development would generate? I think you've said that 1,500 homes would be around 240 additional pupils per year. Yeah, whereas 2,500 would be 400. That's just maths based on, you know, standard. And that would represent 2 forms of entry. Yeah, okay. Well, no, up to 2 forms of entry. 240 per year, would that be nearer 1 form of entry, or would it be?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas a new school would be, the examples you've given for costs, etc., 6, 7 or 8 forms of entry.
Yes.
It wouldn't expect it to be, if there's going to be a new school provided on site or remodeled somewhere else, it wouldn't be smaller than that.
No, I think there is some evidence of 4 to 6 form entry schools, but again, feasibility work would need to consider what would be a viable and operationally, you know, achievable school on the site. And smaller schools are out there, but that would need to be looked at as part of the feasibility work.
Okay, and that sort of scale of school would be, I think, between 9 and 12 hectares based on what you've said, and that could be accommodated within developable area with a part of the 1,500
Yes.
development and whatever. Okay, so the scale of what the development is generating is a proportion of no more than 1/3 of what a new secondary school would be, something of that broad nature. And that's what the developer would be expected to fund, subject to what is said in the statement of common ground about, well, if you started from scratch, you've got to provide some bits of a school that would need to contribute, so that the contribution may need to be a bit more than it would be if you were just adding a classroom onto an existing school, etc. So but that's broadly the extent of what's being proposed here. Okay, so you've updated the costs estimates of a school, and these obviously vary on size and various assumptions made, but so it's somewhere in between 25 million and 45 million. That's the range that's now that's been agreed. So that's helpful. And that would be looked at in the feasibility study based on the exact size of the school, etc. So looking back at how that relates to what the VA assumed, just to clarify, for the 2,500 scheme, it used a cost of 26 million. There seemed to be some bit of confusion about whether the VA assumed all of that would be provided by the developer or a proportion of that. Would it be all of that would be provided by the developer in the VA?
Our understanding is the viability study assumed that 50% of that would be funded by the developer.
Right. And your understanding is that it assumes 100%.
It's misreported in the viability study as being 50% of the total cost, but when Turner Morum have recreated the viability calculations in order to do our own sensitivity, the cost that's assumed to be paid for by Section 106 in the viability study is 100% of the 26.4 million. So I think it's a breakdown understanding between what the growth study said, assuming 50%, but the viability study assumes 100%.
Okay, thank you. But the cost was at that time expected to be around 26. The viability assessment also considered the 1,500 scale development, and that included a different cost of 15.8 million. Yeah, that on the basis that it would be a smaller school, or the development contribution would be smaller, or both.
I think it was done on a 60% of the total, so it
didn't really think through the practicalities how it was
no,
provided. It was thinking about the cost implications of it.
It was just a calculation rather than practical.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Okay, so what's factored into the VA is a contribution of 15 to 26 million, I think is what's been said from the house builder. Fine. So, but we're now looking at a cost of between 25 and 45 million. We'll come on back to that. In terms of looking at it another way, in terms of financial contributions, you provided some figures based on DFE guidance. And I think it refers to a figure of around 32,000 per pupil would be, that's some formula that it can be used. If you were adding classroom capacity to an existing school, this would be.
Yes.
Yeah, which is a bit different than if you're building a new school, but leaving that aside. So on the basis of 240 pupils, is it pure maths that leads to 7.7 million? Is it, you just multiply it up like that?
Yes, if you were using that calculation.
Yeah,
yes.
okay, just to get this as a context. So that leads to figures of 7.7 million contribution for 240 pupils on my calculation, or 12.8 million on 400 pupils on my calculation. So that would be smaller contributions than the viability assessment assumed. And it wouldn't take account of the additional costs that would come from providing a new school. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So I can look at that, but in practice, you would be looking for bigger contributions from the house builder than those figures.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we know what the viability assessment assumed then about the contribution that the developer could make. But with the additional costs now, so on the basis of a 1,500 scheme house proposal, the developer contribution would be around 16 million. 15.8 million. That was what it's assumed in the VA, yeah. Okay, but the cost of the new, if it was a new school, the cost could be 25 to 45. So there's quite a big gap, basically. So the funding, you've referred to a number of sources potentially, including SIL again. Presumably a limit to what, I mean, you've got a 1, 2, 3 list, but you can't fund everything on your 1, 2, 3 list, presumably. So if you're funding a health centre through SIL, presumably, you know, within a similar time period, making a significant contribution to a big secondary school as well would be difficult.
Well, I mean, that's what needs to be looked at altogether. And,
Yes.
and again, that would form part of the feasibility work in actually understanding what the options are, what the costings are, and then, you know, the funding available. And certainly when you're taking into account, you know, your SIL spend and things like that, all of those projects then would need to be prioritised, and it all goes into the mix in establishing exactly what the opportunities are for this site.
But in terms of what the viability assessed assumed, 16 million, and what now you're saying is that could be the cost, there's quite a big gap.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, there's a larger gap.
A larger gap than
because
previously
costs have
thought.
increased.
Yes, okay. And that could be 10 to 30 million on some estimates based on, you know, those sort of the figures you provided me. Okay. Right. Understood. In terms of, so you've talked about the feasibility study, and that being something that would need to get going as soon as possible, really, when there's a clearer idea about what my thoughts are about the scale of development here. But in terms of, again, I suppose it depends on the feasibility study, but at the moment, extra capacity would be needed for new pupils. That's what, because of the Kennet school situation. So does that mean that this additional capacity would have to be provided relatively early on?
Again, I think that has to be looked at in terms of the feasibility study. It depends on, you know, you don't get very many pupils.
No.
It would be linked in the number of houses, and, you know, it'd be that sort of, you know, by the 100th house, but we'd have to look at that through the feasibility study as to when capacity would be reached. And it could be that, yes, it's needed early on, but it could also be that actually it's not needed till much more of the development's taken place. It all comes down to the sort of the calculations around the number of pupils in the school at the time.
But yes, but there would be a point, wouldn't there, that if there's extra capacity is going to be needed, it would be needed to be provided, and it would have to, the house building, well, I mean, the policy refers to phasing. So there's going to be a point, isn't there, that this process is going to sort of say that we need to get this funding, we need to get the school built.
Yes, at some
To
point
allow
it would need to be, yeah.
some number of homes to, you can't go beyond, whether it's 200, 500 or whatever. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that maybe in terms of the assumptions made when you were talking about the build rates later, you know, from whenever building starts, you know, going through the action point 26, about how these sort of assumptions have been factored into those figures. So I'll leave that for now. Okay. I'll open it up to others. I'll start with North East Thatcham, but unless there's anything else you want to say on the school, no. I mean, sorry, I mean, it's probably difficult to say, but if the solution were, say, remodeling of an existing school, I don't know, is that Kennet school, like to be Kennet school?
It could be, but there are other secondary schools that serve Thatcham. So it's one of options. You'd have to consider all the secondary schools that serve Thatcham.
Yeah.
You couldn't just consider Kennet.
But either any of these options, whether it's redeveloping an existing site or building a new school here, will take a number of years to complete through, won't they?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anything else you want to say before I? Yeah, right. Litchfield, do you want to say anything about this? I know that you've basically said that anything that goes beyond what was assumed in the viability assessment for a contribution, which is either 16 million for the 1,500 homes or 26 million for the 2,500 homes, would put pressure on the viability of the scheme unless it was funded else by other means, I suppose.
I think respectfully, so I think you were right on the first point, but not the second. So at 1,500, the viability shows that it can, the scheme is viable at the 15.8 million. But the viability headroom is only 4.7 million on top of that, if you see what I mean. And in a sense, you wouldn't progress on a scheme with a, you know, with zero sort of buffer, if you like, or margin in that.
So sorry. So just be clear then. So if you assumed 16 million and you've only got a headroom of less than 5 million,
Yeah.
you couldn't go ahead if the scheme, if this cost of the secondary school was 20 million or more, because you haven't got funds identified.
Yeah, and you know, unless the feasibility study identified sort of pots of other,
Unless there's other money brought in beyond what you could contribute.
which in a sense, what I think comes from the statement of common ground is that there might be other resources available, but those resources aren't identified at the moment. So that's the second point, unless I misunderstood you, that isn't correct, is that the key point around the 2,500 is that the headroom is significantly greater, so that if, and in fact the figure that's identified in the position statement is there is an extra 81 million pounds of infrastructure headroom, if you like, such
is that comparable to the 4.7 million? Is that the overall headroom? The
Yes.
difference between the residual, sorry, the benchmark land value and the residual value, it becomes 81.
Yeah. So if you took the benchmark land value as a fix, because in a sense that, I mean, it goes to the whole point that the site stays the same size, but the amount of land that's the amount of development and value generated is proportionately reduced. The fixed costs are in many respects the same. You start to build a road through it and all of those kind of things, but obviously everything you're building between 1,500 and 2,500, you're proportionately generating more value that's available for other infrastructure if it is needed. So the key point is that if the secondary school solution did cost more than the 26 million that's assumed in the viability study, the scheme could wear it. I mean, obviously it was slightly justified and all of those kind of things, but there could be a lot of confidence that the scheme would remain viable, even if the secondary school solution significantly increased in cost and other sources of public money weren't available. And, you know, insofar as the development is paying sort of pro rata more per pupil than it might do if one was, say, only providing classrooms, if that was demonstrated that was the only way of delivering a viable secondary school that forms its purpose, then in a sense that would pass the appropriate policy and legal tests. So I think the essence of our point is, and it goes, the risk of repeating, because it goes to the very reason that the scheme was identified at 2,500 for, is that provides the scale and the resource to deliver infrastructure at a level that has the potential to benefit the wider town. And at 1,500, you just don't have the headroom to achieve that. And in a sense, the secondary school is the best example of that fundamental point. One final point is obviously the council's education team have identified the SEND provision, and in a sense we're comfortable with that. If there's a need to meet SEND requirements, then in a sense that's fine. But you know, none of those items have been costed yet. So even if, you know, the secondary school was at the lower end of the matrix range that we've identified, one might say they'll send provision to, you know, in whatever form that might be, to go on top of that. And again, that raises doubts about, you know, whether the 1,500 unit scheme could, you know, how much contribution it could make to that.
In terms of your view on the timing, the implications of timing of development and this sort of provision, whether it's a financial contribution from a 1,500 house development of around 15 million to improve capacity, either by a new school on site or off site, or a larger development that would have this greater headroom, and the school provision might be the same, or whatever, it may change the formula. The timing of that, you know, any thoughts about that, given where we are now, and, you know, how long this could all take to get this extra capacity provided?
I mean, there's an element where, in a sense, it has to be subject to the feasibility study. That there are, just to step back a little bit, the pupil numbers that we've identified are, in a sense, an average based on a sort of an average mix. So once one got into what the mix of homes were on site, if there were more larger homes, for example, then that might generate greater pupil numbers than has been identified in table whatever the number is in the statement of common ground.
Yeah.
The second point is around the timing of pupils who are generated, and again, feasibility study would look into this, but what evidence tends to show is that when new homes are built and families move into them, a lot of those moves tend to happen with families who are either about to have children or have young children, who then go through the primary system before eventually sort of flowing through to the secondary system. So the secondary school pupil generation numbers, the phasing of those might well be further back in the development programme rather than at the beginning, and one would expect to see, for example, primary schools being provided before secondary schools. So that's that point. Physically, the secondary school site in the master plan is on the edge of the site, and in a sense access can be provided relatively straightforwardly. So in terms of making the site available, that's straightforward. And then, you know, beyond that, it's really a matter for the feasibility study of when it's required, and in a sense, when it's required, the contribution will be made. And, you know, you can phase the introduction of a secondary school, for example. So you might see, you know, it built with, you know, an initial sort of form or two forms of entry with the facilities, and then gradually expand out. So that total cost doesn't just sort of land or doesn't have to land in a single year within a cash flow of the development.
There's one other point though, just to add on to that, which goes to, it's a slightly different point in terms of the relationship between the house building rates and the feasibility study. For the reasons that was set out, the feasibility study can only really take place at a point where you know whether those trends about birth rates and so on are going to continue or change in any way. So there's an inevitable lag in that work. It's going to be difficult to do it, obviously, right at the beginning of the process in tandem with the master plan. And it goes to the point, because of the consequences, obviously, of the higher numbers potentially being required, about certainty of higher numbers. It's one of those things that makes the whole scheme assessment and appraisal more difficult and more risky, because you don't know in the end, even with the mitigations that Mr. Spry was just mentioning about phasing of secondary school provisions, what you're going to be in for, if you like, in the end. And it's part of the case, if you like, part of the argument in support of the higher number rather than the lower number.
Okay, thank you for that. Just going, Mr. Spider's going on practice, but I think what you're saying about the way that the concept plans have been drafted through the growth study in your own work, it shows the school, if there's a next secondary school, it would be down the southern part of the site, off one of the new access roads. So physically, you're saying there's nothing to stop it being provided early on in the development, in the way that the development would grow from the south going northwards in a number of different pockets. So in terms of physically, that would be possible. It's the timing and the funding, etc., that would to be the determining factor rather than anything about the layout.
Yes, you do not need to sort of build halfway into the site.
Yeah.
You know, before you make that provision.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. Let's take Vincent's Lane, and then I'll come down this way.
Thank you, sir. I think it's difficult to underestimate the significance of this particular issue in terms of the sort of sustainable master planning of the future of both North East Thatcham and the wider Thatcham and Newbury. And I think part of that reason harks back to the discussion you had earlier on about the relationship between what the development is providing per se, and what it's doing in terms of knitting existing inadequacies in existing provision. And we've already heard about existing secondary schools in Thatcham being over capacity. We know that anecdotally there are significant numbers of students being bused from Thatcham to Newbury secondary schools. And indeed, the significance of the issue is indicated by when the new administration took over in 2023, it introduced a transformation programme. And there were 6 strands to this transformation programme, and only 2 service areas were selected. One of them was home to school transport. So it's quite clear that there is a significant issue for the council corporately. And I think that there is a risk, if the feasibility study isn't timely, that it will create some challenges, not just in terms of viability and delivery, but if we jump across to Sandalford Park and the Sandalford Park West application that was considered in earlier on this April, I think, 2024, that's 1501,585. Paragraph 23.9 of the officer report talks about secondary education. It indicates that the previous application for Sandalford Park West included land and provision for financial contributions for secondary provision, but there was none such in the revised application. And a feasibility study was therefore undertaken between the developers and the council, and mitigations have been agreed. But I would contend that that is neither timely nor properly planned to have to be at the late stage of an outline application, when, you know, as we heard previously, Sandalford Park had been on the books for many years. And I do think it's important that this feasibility study, whilst I would agree with Mr. Spry's general remarks about the earlier adopters of the new development tending to have younger children, and then they pass through primary into secondary, you know, that doesn't obviate the need to consider the issue in the round and the existing service inadequacies. And I do think it is an issue that should be addressed right from the outset, because of the fundamental link to master planning of the new community. And you know, we have provision for reviews through Section 106, which were often undone on education contributions as a large-scale development continues. So I would suggest that this is something that needs to be tackled right from the outset. And it really has a bearing on the timetable for delivery, which we will come back to a little later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Reid. That, Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. I think we fully understand the viability issues here that have been discussed, and equally the importance of this as an issue in the overall how this site and overall within the council. I think it's very important that this study, in terms of the feasibility study, is undertaken. In fact, we say, sir, that it is overdue. It should have really been done ahead of the plan, and more work should have been done, because we do not feel that this is an opportunity to reopen consideration of whether the site should stand 2,500 units. I understand why that's being put to you, but I think the reason it's being put to you is because there's significant ambiguity around where that funding will come from. And I think that makes it so much more important why this feasibility study is undertaken quickly. The key part of that feasibility study is around the sources of funding, exactly what is available in terms of SIL, what might be available in terms of other funding from the DFE. And equally as part of that, for the council and North East Thatcham Partnership to come to a position on exactly where the share of costs is. Because I think if effectively there are further costs, then there would be a position where North East Thatcham could be indemnified to an extent, but it should not be a position where 2,500 units is put back on the table. The council have taken that out of off the table for other reasons, and they've set those out to you, and we effectively agree with those reasons. To put it then back on the table just to deal with an education funding issue would be a matter of significant soundness. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So the only reason that we're having this discussion is that the plan was not ready for examination when it was submitted. Thatcham Town Council made these points in detail in our representations, and in the 3 weeks that the council had between the close of the consultation and when they submitted the plan, they clearly didn't have time to consider the points in detail. So just to address some of the specific points here, the council does know with very high precision what the roll call for secondary education is until at least 2030, because all of those pupils are in primary education within West Berkshire, or allocated to primary schools to start in September. So it's unclear to me why further work is needed in that regard. I think we can also, at this point, discount a new secondary school completely. And there is evidence in the evidence pack behind that, and I will briefly draw your attention to it. So firstly, in the duty to cooperate statement, there is a statement of common ground between the for West Berkshire area, which in table 5 in paragraph 4.31 gives us 1 times 6 times FE per 5,000 dwellings. So that was the requirement that was in the statement of common ground between the local authorities in West Berkshire, in the west of Berkshire, sorry. So that is one point of evidence. And then moving on to the evidence submitted by Thatcham Town Council in its appendices, we submitted the West Berkshire Council School Places Plan of 2010, which is old, but I believe still in force. And that said that 11 to 16 schools with 5 full-time FE or fewer would be unlikely to offer a good curriculum without disproportionately generous staffing. And don't forget here that that this school is would almost be within shouting distance of Kennet School, which is an outstanding academy. So there is a risk that if you have a school which is has great challenges in providing a broad curriculum adjacent to an outstanding academy, then it will unlikely to thrive. Then we also submitted a more recent document, which is attachment 6 to our representations, which was a Department for Education guide to school funding, which just to draw your attention to was for free schools. And of course, there's more flexibility given to free schools than to academies or maintained schools. And that references, in order to provide sustainable, broad and balanced curriculum, there is a presumption that secondary provision, years 7 to 11, have a minimum of 4 forms of entry of 30 pupils. It should be noted that it also says that the drop-off rate for year 12 to 13 is around 15%. Finally, not in your evidence pack, but I discovered that Homes England had provided guidance in November 2023 on new homes and school places. And that states, while the size of schools differs across the country, the latest data for 2022-23 shows that the average, so secondary schools are typically bigger, and in 2022-2023, the average secondary school in England accommodates 1,054 pupils. And it equates, according to their calculation, one average size secondary school per 8,107 homes. That was a figure that is given in that guidance by Homes England from November of last year. So I think it's quite clear that a freestanding secondary school is not viable for 1,500 homes or for 2,500 homes. Therefore, I suggest that it is disregarded at this point. Doesn't need further study. The evidence is sufficiently strong, and indeed that guidance says that the pupil numbers is dropping slightly. But of course, West Berkshire Council will have that full information on the existing population through the primary school numbers. So, of the options that were given in the statement of common ground, SEND will provide us. The demand is a small number, and SEND by itself will not meet even if it was provided to serve a wider area than North East Thatcham, it wouldn't provide enough capacity to equate to the equivalent demand. As far as Kennet School goes, as I mentioned when we last considered policy SB 17, the school was built for 1,200 pupils. The current maximum roll call is 1,890 pupils. On the day that I was able to speak to the executive head teacher, the actual head pupil count was 1,891 pupils. So it's already at absolutely bursting capacity. The school, that number of pupils is significantly above the maximum value in the DfE guidance for the area required for a secondary school. So there would not be permitted any increase in the size on that site. There are within Thatcham there are two. Thatcham is covered by two catchment areas only. That is Kennet School and Trinity School, which is next door to Shaw House. You might have heard them in our coffee breaks, and that is obviously already a substantial journey. And the boundary between those two catchment areas is Northfield Road. So a substantial portion of the pupils in Thatcham already have to come to Newbury, and as Councillor Reid has said, that there is insufficient capacity there, so some of them are forced, particularly in the adjoining villages, are forced to go substantial different distances rather than to their local school. So even if we were to bring increase the capacity for those villages, I think it is implausible that there would be sufficient demand for a complete new school. Which would have to be five, probably six forms of entry to be provide a comparable curriculum to Kennet School. So the remaining option is the sixth form campus. In principle, the executive head teacher was interested in that. As I understand it, there has been no communication with the trust about that. I don't understand why, because the policy SB 16 for Sandalford references a specific expansion of Parkhouse School, and a sixth form campus for Kennet School would be an expansion, albeit off-site. I don't understand why being off-site versus on-site would be material. Indeed, it's not clear from the policy SB 16 whether that expansion would be on-site or off-site. So therefore, in conclusion, I think that it is implausible that there is demand for a new secondary school would be sound and would be a viable educational institution. That leaves one option, which is the sixth form campus. And the size of that is to some extent dependent on the size of the sixth form for the existing school. It's very disappointing that no work was being done up to now. cast doubt on the soundness of the plan more broadly, I suggest. But I think that the work needs to focus on the viability of a sixth form campus. Thank you, sir. I should say that there are other options which I have discussed informally, which are in principle viable. They're not public, so I don't wish to say them here in front of the a recording to the general public. But it's also disappointing that other options which would in principle be viable and provide the correct amount of education provision haven't been considered. Also calls into question how much the planning policy team has consulted their colleagues in the education team. Thank you, sir.
In terms of what you say about, you think that the only possible sensible viable option would be to have a sixth form on the site. Presumably that would free up capacity at the existing secondary schools. That's the idea, and therefore the pupils from this development.
Yes. And one of the points made by the executive head teacher is if such a facility. I think firstly there's a question about the number of forms of entry, because there is also guidance on the maximum number, and that expansion overall might exceed that maximum number. But the comment that she made was that for this to be viable, there needs to be synergy between the two facilities in terms of the overheads and the support services. And therefore, it wouldn't be viable to have a separate organisation managing the sixth form provision from the years 1 to 5. And also, of course, the overlap of staff between the two year groups. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay. Anything else the council wishes to say in relation to, in response to what's been said, or provide any further observations?
So yeah, if we can come back on a few of these points, just to clarify, please. I mean, overall, I think what we're straying into here is a lot of the detail that needs to be worked through in that feasibility study. And that's, I think that comes across in the statement of common ground. We've made that point several times, that we need to work through and really establish what is the most appropriate form of provision on this site, or whether it is off-site. We're not certain that, a full 8 FE secondary school is required. And we don't accept the point that 2,500 units would make this a more, make it a more safe option. With 1,500 units, I think we need to remember that that's less pupils to cater for, and so then you can have some other options. So that's what we're talking about with the feasibility study. There's less pupils to consider, so then we could explore various options. We're not forced so much further down the route of needing to provide a new school. So that's something just to bear in mind when considering those. But we are still looking at, the focus here is on 1,500 units, and that's what we've been dealing with. That's how we've approached this, and that's what we'll be looking at through the feasibility work. And then just a couple of points of clarification. The home to school transport issue. Yes, there is a transformation programme around that, but the only issue isn't necessarily around busing children from Thatcham to Newbury, and that isn't a significant issue. There's parental choice about where children will go. There's in-year moves and things that tip things over, but there's not a significant issue. We have been consulting with our education colleagues. All of this information, the statement of common ground, was prepared with that input from our education colleagues. So this isn't just, us policy planners here with ideas. This is based on information from our education team.
But doesn't it indicate, I suppose, essentially what Mr. Pike's saying, that there's a whole load of uncertainty? I mean, the Thatcham strategic growth study was done a number of years ago. Part of the rationale for this strategic development was that it would, from where I started from, it would help to deliver improved and increased capacity of social infrastructure that's needed in the town. I tried to clarify what that is meant by that, but secondary schools seem to be one of the things. There's a lot of talk about existing schools being at capacity and being old and whatever. So a fundamental part of this development seemed to be it would provide a new secondary school to serve the development and the wider community. That seemed to be part of the reason justification for the whole approach. But now it seems to be, well, no, we want these homes and we'll work out how we can squeeze the pupils into, additional capacity somewhere that could be on site, but somewhere else. It seems to be a different kind of
Just on
emphasis.
that, just on that last point, it's not a question of squeezing pupils
sorry.
in. I know you didn't mean it like that, but there are various options that can be considered through the feasibility study. It's not necessarily that the pupils generated from 1,500 homes need to be in a brand new secondary school. There are various options, and Mr. Pike touched on a couple of them, like the sixth form, that could be funded as a standalone option and free up capacity at Kennet. And there are complexities to forecasting. And in terms of whether this should have been done earlier or not, another uncertainty at the moment is that it is highly likely there's going to be a change of government soon, and a whole new, possibly, raft of policies that the Education Department at West Berkshire will have to take into account that could introduce other things that need to be taken account of in the feasibility study. So it could have been done, but then it might have had to have been done again because there could be changes of policy coming very soon. The way forward is the feasibility study, yes, done as soon as possible. And there are a number of options that the Education Department are confident exist in order to accommodate future pupils.
Okay, thank you. How long would a feasibility study take from when it starts? Is it a matter of weeks, months?
I mean, it depends on the scope of that study and things like that. It could take up to a year, so it could continue during the process of all of that master planning work and the detail that we're going to work through. So it would fit with the timescales that we've got in terms of preparation.
Okay, well, we'll come on to the timescales, the master planning process, and what that entails shortly. Okay. Right, thank you. Yes, let's go around again. I'll start with Lichfields and then we'll come back down.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we've just sort of has come out of that discussion, I think, really reinforces the problems that have arisen from shifting from the original 2,500 to the 1,500, and in a sense why 2,500 was calibrated broadly the right amount, because there were two reasons for, or maybe three reasons for, envisaging that the site would have a sort of significant contribution to providing secondary education, potentially, including a secondary school. One was to help make provision in Thatcham for kids who currently go to Newbury and therefore can't go to their local school, which is in a sense a source of demand for a secondary school in Thatcham, additional secondary capacity in Thatcham. It was also for the pupils generated by the development itself. And obviously, the more homes are built, the more pupils are generated, and in combination, they come together to justify a viable secondary school. So it stands to reason, if you reduce the number of pupils that you're, and sorry, in the original evidence base sort of pitched as sort of 6 to 8 forms of entry. So if you take down the number of pupils generated, I'm sorry, this is a really obvious point, but if you take down the number of pupils generated by the development, you create a potential gap in how you can have a viable secondary school to meet those two sources of demand, because you've got a gap in the demand for it. Not setting aside the funding point, but a gap in the demand side of it. And hence, what we've now got is the council saying, well, at 1,500, there's less pupils, so maybe we can sort of tuck them in somewhere into the existing system in some way.
We build up for using tucked in as well as squeezed in, I think.
Yeah, well,
But
I
yeah, understand.
squeeze has been squashed, so I thought go with tuck, but addressed or incorporated within the existing capacity, but in a way that's not been defined. One thing we do know is that Kennet is at capacity, and I think the point Mr. Pike made earlier was right, and certainly reflects our understanding is I think I may even be right in thinking that you would need DFE approval to actually add extra forms of entry into that secondary school, because it's already at, I think, 10. So, you know, setting aside the size of the site and whether the sixth form is on or off site, you shouldn't have more than 10 forms of entry in a secondary school. Hence, you can't expand sort of Kennet in that conventional way. And there's no answers being provided as to what the alternative would be to some form of secondary school provision on the site. Now, obviously, the feasibility study has to be done, but you add all that together, it's at the very least a reasonable possibility a secondary school provision would be required on site. We know that that should sensibly be a sixth form of entry. And we know that the cost for that is, you know, applying the inflation figures, you know, 30, well, let's say 20 to be generous and say 28 to 30 million. And we don't have any confidence that there are any other sources of funding available. And, you know, the basic need funding, which DFE provides, is sort of predicated on a growing number of pupils. In a sense, we've been told that's not the position, certainly at the moment. So in terms of having a concept signed off at North East Thatcham in this plan that provides additional secondary school capacity to address not just the needs of the development, but also to make provision for existing secondary school kids in Thatcham who have to go elsewhere. It's only a scheme at 2,500 that has the viability headroom to give assurance that if the output of the feasibility study is a secondary school at any sort of sensible proposal, that this is the form of development that can actually deliver it. And we certainly know that 1,500 can't deliver that.
Slightly less ambiguous statement than in the statement of common ground, I think, where it was there was a reasonable prospect that it may not be possible or something like that.
If not, what I said was if the answer was a secondary school,
Yeah,
then that wouldn't be
based on those costs and what the VA assumes.
If the feasibility study did come to a different conclusion,
yeah,
then the answer might well be feasible at 1,500. But the point is, it's a reasonable possibility the answer is a secondary school.
Yeah, okay, understood. Thank you. Councillor Reid.
Thank you, sir. Just a point of clarity on home to school transport. Yes, you can choose which schools go in, unless you qualify for free home to school transport, and you fit within that income bracket or need, in which case you have to go to the nearest school. So hence pupils in Wolverhampton, for example, who qualify for free home to school transport have to go to Hadley, as an example.
Bucklebury.
Yes, thank you, sir. I think looking back again into, well, hearing some of what's been said around how long the feasibility study will take, and granted these things do take some time. However, I don't think you need that feasibility study to come to a position on how this is going to be delivered and overall soundness. So if you look at your point on AP 25 to the council, you asked them to prepare that statement of common ground. And as part of that, you asked for the proportion and amount of overall cost to be met by the developer and the proportion amount of overall cost to be met by others, along with potential sources of funding. So my reading of the statement of common ground is you have an element of what that other funding may well be and the sources of it, but not really any detail other than a couple of paragraphs of could be SIL, could be other things, could be DFE funding, but you have no evidence of the proportion and overall cost to be met by the developer. So what we would say, so as a suggestion, is that you could ask the council and North East Action Partnership to go back and reconsider that statement of common ground to provide you with more certainty around that. You don't need a whole feasibility study, but you could be given further information on sources of funding and actually what proportion that's being expected to be met by the developer would be, because that's not in the statement in front of you.
Well, my reading was that they referred back to the viability assessment and that assumed a developer contribution of just under 16 million from the 1500 scheme or 25 million from the 2500 scheme. And that's what the contribution would be. And hence my saying, well, based on the cost estimates that they provided, there is therefore a significant gap of, I don't know what it was now, between 10 and 25 million would have to be met from elsewhere without any funding sources, specific funding sources having been identified.
And that's an element of uncommon ground between the parties. That's why we say there's so much uncertainty around
Yeah,
this
understood.
that is needed in order for you to come to a decision on whether this policy is sound or not. You've been told by the council that it is 1,500 units. It's not 2,500 units. So it's on that basis that this statement of common ground should be produced. And you could have a scenario where the council and North East Action Partnership come to the table on the basis of that's the amount. What is the exact figures that are being provided here? And what are those other sources of funding? They need a full feasibility study to come to those positions.
Understood. Okay. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So I have to correct you slightly, sir, that the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study did consider two options, which was a new secondary school for pupils and a second Kennet School campus. That's paragraph 4.86 of the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study 3. And the reason for the new secondary school says it would potentially retain more pupils resident in Thatcham who would otherwise have travelled to Trinity School, which is undoubtedly true, but I don't think it's consistent with the government policy for funding of schools, that they don't fund excess provision simply to enable people to travel less distance, provided they're travelling within the guidance already, which I believe is the case for Trinity School for the pupils from Thatcham. So as far as the feasibility study goes, I think there are two steps. The first one is to calculate what is the demand, and I'd expect that the Education Department of West Berkshire Council already has that as a spreadsheet, and that will tell you very quickly within a fortnight what options will fly, because they will know what the excess demand is for pupils in West Berkshire. And I guess the greatest uncertainty is North Thatcham, which is being built at the present, and that will feed, I guess, into Trinity School next door here. But that has already got detailed planning permission. The sizes of the houses are known, that the standard calculations can be made for the pupils, for the pupil numbers resulting from those houses when they're occupied. And I expect that the council has done that already. So it is very quick to work out which options are capable of further consideration in detail in the feasibility study. And unless there's a vast number of pupils that we're unaware of who are not be capable of being given provision at the moment, then it seems to me very unlikely that that unmet need will more than double the number of pupils that would go to a new school in North East Thatcham, because that's what we're talking about. You know, even 2,500 houses is 2 forms of entry. A viable school is 5 to 6 forms of entry. Therefore, I think it's implausible, unless something massively bad planning by preparation by West Berkshire Council education team, which I don't think is the case, that there is this hidden unmet need. I think you could almost discount the secondary school on the basis of the statements of common ground for the number of pupils and the evidence, as I've quoted to you, from the evidence that's already available before
Okay.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've got the point.
And it might take longer to determine whether what I think is the one remaining option is viable, but I think all of the other options can be excluded extremely quickly. Thank you.
Okay. Litchfields.
Yeah, just come back on a point that you said earlier on in terms of the in response to Mr. Black about the amount that's been provided. So as I understand, your request was to look at the 1,500 and 2,500 scenario, and then to include approximate figures for the following. And what we've got in the statement of common ground at 135 is some illustrations based on the viability of the amounts that are assumed. And I suppose the key point is those aren't fixed amounts, because in a sense, what the actual contribution will be will depend on the feasibility study. That feasibility study will need to take account of what the send requirements might be, which weren't considered at the time the viability study or the Thatcham growth study was carried out. What's addressed at 1.35.3 at A and B is the amounts that are assumed in the viability study and how that relates as a percentage to the maximum cost identified. In a sense, that's as far as one could go in terms of the sort of fixed points. Well, they're not even fixed, are they? But some of the points that are kind of recorded in the material. The key point is if the feasibility study identifies that, for example, it's a sixth form of entry school and there's a certain amount of send contribution, and that there aren't other sources of funding available to provide that that provision, then in order for it to be delivered, the Section 106 contribution would have to be proportionate to what was required to make it happen. Because if it didn't happen, the development wouldn't be the impact wouldn't be mitigated, and so on and so forth. So the key question, which we keep on coming back to, is if the number needed to increase beyond what's been assumed, could it? And the key point is that at 1,500, it couldn't really, because the headroom is limited. But but at the 2,500, it could increase potentially quite markedly based on the headroom sphere. So I don't want us to come away from this conversation or discussion thinking that the amount that 2,500 can contribute is 26.4 million. That's the amount that's been put into the viability study drawn from the growth study. But if it turned out to be a higher number based on, you know, a different or greater form of provision than was originally set out, then that number would increase.
Yeah, understood.
And
Just to be
potentially
clear-
to 100% of the cost.
Yeah, because of the 80%,
Yeah.
80 million headroom that there is between the.
And therefore there wouldn't necessarily be a public funding gap that needed to be addressed. I think that our point on the 1,500 is there's a greater risk that if the provision, you know, is a school plus some SEND provision, and it's something resembling the costs in the table in the statements of common ground, there potentially would be a gap because there's no viability headroom and we haven't yet identified the public sector sources of funding to meet that. And indeed, it's, you know, wouldn't be possible to do so right now ahead of the feasibility study.
And just to be clear, when in that paragraph that you just referred me to, 1.35 of the statement of common ground, paragraph 3, A and B, when it refers to percentages of the maximum cost identified, that's table 2 in this statement of common ground cost, isn't it? It's not, you're not going back to the costs in the VA.
No, it's relating to the 44 million in that table 2. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right. Very
quickly, just to say that on the basis of the evidence before you, neither 1,500 homes nor 2,500 homes is a viable secondary school by itself. That numbers are sufficient. The numbers to make it viable is equivalent to the pupil numbers from an extra 4,000 houses. And so I don't think there are 4,000 houses in West Berkshire which are unprovided with secondary education. So I therefore invite you to say that there is no reason on the basis of education to depart from the current policy of 1,500. Indeed, I think it would be more, I would urge you to consider whether the plan as it stands is unsound because there is no sustainable provision for education demonstrated. Thank you, sir.
Just can't say that. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear around, what's happening at Kennet, people in Thatcham having to go off site, and pupils generated by development, which could be greater than the number that's identified if the mix of homes is more sort of family homes and so on. So, I mean, you can't make that blind assertion and just assume that we.
Okay, look, I'm going to end it here, but my understanding is that we can quantify in broad terms, based on the housing mix, etc., some estimate of how much additional classroom space and capacity is needed for 1,500 homes, 2,500 homes. So that's a couple of forms, up to a couple of forms of entry. What we do know at the moment is that the existing schools in Thatcham are at capacity and that some children are having to go elsewhere, and therefore it could be a good thing to have more capacity in Thatcham to pick up some of that. What we don't have is a quantification of that in terms of how many additional classrooms. I think that's what's been said, hence the need for the feasibility study to work that through.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But I think what we don't have is the ability to suddenly say, therefore, there's no demand for us.
Or what the additional capacity should be, or where it should be. Back to what we'll come on to later, what needs to be sorted out through the master planning process.
I think the point is that I agree, there is no evidence before you on that. Thank you, sir.
Right. Okay. Anything else planning from the council on secondary school at this stage? No, okay, thank you. So I think what we'll do now is I'm just going to deal with the next agenda item, Thatcham Strategic Growth Study and the West Berkshire Vision and the amended reason justification referring to that. And then I think we'll have a lunch break and then come back and deal with the master planning process and the timetable for development, both of which, quite substantive issues that we need to talk about. So let's just think then at the response to the discussion that we had previously in my action points relating to how these two bits of work are referred to. So essentially, it's essentially a kind of factual reference to the two documents and when they were produced, what their stated purpose is, and that the include relevant information that forms part of the justification for the planned strategy and these allocations in Newbury and Thatcham. It doesn't then go on to start giving them any particular weight to be taken forward through master planning or anything like that. So it's just basically a factual statement of what they were when they were done, and that's part of why the plan proposes what it does. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Right. Any comments you wish to make on that? Let's start with Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. I think that is accepted in terms of how that modification works. I think then again, not mean to repeat myself, but again, the status of those as documents once the master planning works being carried out is the council effectively is a question around what weight the council is going to give to those documents, and the fact they're still here within the justification text suggests that there's still going to be a weight apportioned to them. We say we accept that they're part of the evidence base of the plan. They were done. We accept that.
Yeah.
You've had our points on it previously. However, what weight do those still carry once the plan's moved on? That's the simple question we've got.
Well, I suppose it is a valid question, but what the plan is not saying is that they have any weight going forward now, does it? It just says that they were done and they were part of the reason justification, and I think it's a statement of historical facts. It doesn't start talking about them, being used to inform the master planning process from now onward.
Yeah, I mean that's our understanding as well. The question is, if there's no weight at all, does there even need to be any reference to it at all?
I suppose it
Probably
comes back to some of the
semantics, but-
fundamental points we've been talking about. What is the strategic rationale for a strategic site at Thatcham? And those clearly did, Thatcham Strategic Growth Study identified these social infrastructure type issues and things like that that were needed. Very briefly, Mr. Pike.
Thank you. I agree with Bucklebury Parish Council that if this was purely a statement of historical record, then I would have no difficulty with it. But if it's in the policy, then it will be cited. If it's in the document, even if it's in the supporting text, it will be cited in planning applications. And I think the council said it's not wholly out of date. I can't find the reference at the moment, which is a rather weak justification for including a reference in a document. There are lots of other supporting evidence documents which are not referenced from the relevant policies. And these are particularly problematic because many of their elements, it says that these documents include relevant information. So the question which would be asked in a planning application is which of the information is relevant and which is not. Some of it is clearly not because it refers to 2,500 houses and other things which are clearly contrary to the plan. And indeed, by the time of any planning application, there will be a master plan which supersedes this in its entirety. So I think that there is no reason in planning terms to include these particular references. It's inconsistent with the rest of the document to include historical references on evidence documents, and it is a risk in the future, having sat through a large number of planning applications and a couple of appeals, that this is the sort of thing that will be cited by expert witnesses and will have to be argued against and possibly lost. And therefore, it is better that the references are removed completely, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll talk about the master planning process this afternoon. Anything further? Sorry, when I referred before to my summary of what it now says, that was paragraph 6.54. There is an additional reference in 663, which does talk about the master plan being based on existing evidence and information already produced, including the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study. Well, again, I think that's probably factually correct. There is giving it undue weight. We can talk about, I think more important is we talk about what the master planning process is, how it will be carried out, when, how long it will take, and etc. What status it will have, I think. So we'll come back to that this afternoon. I think that's a good time to break. So we'll have lunch now until, what time is it? Until 1:30, so just under an hour. And then we'll pick up the last three items on the agenda, the master plan process and the timetable for development. Okay, thank you.